Welcome back to the Budding Author Podcast with me, Simon Ward, your host. Today, we're going to talk to the author of the McCoy Mysteries, the Unreal McCoy. Well, the Unreal McCoy is one and only Dennis Collins. Hi, Dennis. How you doing?
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Oh, it's good to see you too. Good to have you on the show. Tell us about your writing journey, Dennis. You've had a good career, haven't you, in sort of mechanical engineering and the likes? When did writing become a thing for you?
Well, when I was a young boy, we used to go to Saturday matinees at the theater, and we watched a cowboy movie. And so when I was in the fourth grade, I had a notebook and I wrote a little cowboy story. And I must have lost the notebook, and the nun found it. And she got me in front of the class. She called me a nincompoop and said, "This story is violent. Why? It's a cowboy story." And she said, "This story is violent. I should expel you from school." Well, I was terrified at the time, being in the fourth grade, what are you, 9 or 10 years old?
Yeah.
And, but then I got thinking about it. That meant she had to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it got her interest. And it provoked a reaction, a very solid reaction. I mean, what more can an author ask for?
Well,
And
that's the people.
I,
If people read it all the way through, then it's got to be reasonable, hasn't it? Yeah.
yes, and I got even with her. I put her in one of my books, and I made her nice. So I figure I got my revenge.
Oh, that's beauty. That is. That's beauty. Um. So, when did you release the McCoy Mysteries, the first one?
I think that was about 2000. Was
Okay.
Yeah, I had trouble getting people to review it because they didn't like the publisher. And I went to one. I went to a book club meeting at our state capital. That's where our Michigan State University is and all that other stuff. And the
Yeah.
local newspaper has a reviewer who's notably tough. And I wanted him to look at the book. And
Yeah.
he didn't want to read it. And he told me, "Well, give it to me and I'll let you know." And then I got a letter saying, or an email saying, "Check out the Lansing State Journal on Sunday." And I did. And his review started with bashing the publisher, saying that their books are full of typos and fraught with errors. But
Yeah.
once in a while, you find a diamond. And that made my whole day right there.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a big thing for me.
And
And,
did the sales sort of explode from there, or was it slow growth?
well, I'm one of those people who writes. My method is known as stream of consciousness.
I wanted
I
to
don't
talk
write with
about
an
that.
outline. That the Unreal McCoy was inspired. I saw an article in a newspaper that was sort of interesting and had a photograph of the man featured in the article. And then a few years later, I saw that same photograph in a newspaper, and it was the man's obituary. He had died. And I remembered every word of the earlier article. So I thought, this must be a big story. So I used that as the germ for the Unreal McCoy. I
Yeah.
had to build a whole story around it. And that's pretty much the way I've done every one of my books.
Yeah.
They were always inspired by something small,
So
maybe only a few words.
yeah.
And that was it. I uh, I know my father was a musician, and that is like a lot of worlds where there's a lot of great musicians, but only a few of them make it to the top. And
Absolutely.
my dad did in his era. He had a number one record, but uh, it was agents that got him there. It wasn't his talent. and there are a lot of people that's talented.
Yeah.
It was who he knew in the business. And so I decided I would just do that. And the Turn Left in September is a story that was inspired by that thought. And then one day I had an uncle who served in the World War II. He was my buddy. He was my best friend. He didn't come home, and his body was never recovered. And he was buried somewhere overseas. We didn't even know about this until after his last sibling died. And all the letters between the parents and the boys, there were 5 of the uncles together that were overseas.
Yeah.
And we didn't even know the story until after the last sibling died, which is only a few years back.
Yeah.
And we found a box full of letters that went between the parents and the boys. And I got to thinking that my uncle has been lying in an unmarked grave somewhere in Europe for all these years, and nobody has visited that grave. And I felt that was such a sad thing.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the story. I wrote a chapter, one chapter of a book about his son visiting the grave. And I called it my Academy Award chapter. Yeah, it's a very, very strong chapter. And I felt very, very good about it, but I didn't have a story to go with it. All I had was that, the final chapter of the book. And I wrote the first domino. I had already had established characters that I could feed into a story like that.
Yeah.
And the first domino is I built a story around mobsters and stuff like that, international thing. And that's how I built. And that is my strongest work. I really feel good about that. It takes a serious reader. It's not boring. It moves along, but it has so many different little aspects to it that
Yeah.
yes. And then I was just fooling around on the internet one day, and living in where I live. Michigan is shaped like a mitten. Let's see, how can I do that? Anyway, I'm at the very tip of the thumb of that mitten,
Yeah.
right here. And
Lake Huron, isn't it? Yeah.
pardon?
Lake Huron.
Yeah, I guess it's that. But it's a resort shoreline with an agricultural mainland, and the resorts are very, very busy in the summer because the water is so clean and pure, and there's a bay right next to us, Saginaw Bay on Lake Huron, that is only about 60, 70 feet deep. And so the sun reflecting off the sand on the bottom keeps the temperature of the water very nice for swimmers. And so it's a big resort destination. And I happened to be reading something, and I don't know what it was, but I came across the story of bull sharks. They're the number one man-eating shark. And the thing about them that's unique is that they love fresh water. They're born with a gland in their body that contains salt that recirculates, so they don't need salt water. Lake Nicaragua is a totally landlocked lake, and it's got a lot of sharks in it, as does Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana in the United States. And so I started, and I thought, boy, I got a resort right here with a freshwater lake with moderate temperature water. So I started doing some research about that, and I found that the water temperature in the summertime where I live is perfect. The food chain is exactly what they want: large game, fish, turtles, that kind of stuff. And they would flourish, at least in the summer months, right out in front of my house. But getting them here is the hard part.
Yeah.
So then I started looking, and I found that there are several aquarium supply houses that will sell you a bull shark. Anything from a little baby to an 11-foot long man eater. And so I said, okay, if they can be bought, I can find a way to buy them. And then we had a fishing industry uh, a little ways from here on part of Marshy Bay, and they used what they call gill nets for fishing.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, they outlawed those nets as because they caught too many fish that weren't the right kind,
Yeah.
and it put all those fisheries out of business. Now, the land being very marshy along the lakeshore, this is miles away from me. The government recognized it as a wildlife migratory, wildfowl breeding ground, and they restricted it. You can't build a house there anymore, and you can't even sell a house unless you sell it to the government. So all of those fisheries sold the property to the government, except for the few that were grandfathered down through the family. And that gave me a perfect setting to raise bull sharks. And fortunately, I'm sure you know who Jimmy Buffett is, who is a great rock and roll musician. Caseville, which is the town where the story is set, has the world's largest Jimmy Buffett festival. They call it Cheeseburger. Now, Jimmy Buffett had a song named Cheeseburger in Paradise, and that's what it was named after. The town only has 900 residents. During the Cheeseburger Festival, it draws close to 60,000 people over a 10-day period. And of course, they have a gorgeous bathing beach, and that's a perfect place to release a bunch of hungry man-eating sharks. And I thought, boy, is this a great idea for a story?
I was going to say, Dennis, you sounds like you got a story there. You gave us a bit of a big build up to that, but yeah, I think it's a good idea, sort of having a nugget of an idea and then having it spread out from there, add levels to it.
This is the result.
Oh, is this it? What's it called? What's that say?
It's called Nightmare. And it's a bestseller around here because I can set up all during the Cheeseburger Festival. I do book signings. I do about 15 book signings, and I sell a lot.
Is that where you got a lot of your? Is that where you get a lot of your sales from sort of book signings
my
physical rather than the digital world?
My books are all available on Amazon, and which is a big seller. It's worldwide. I'm in all the countries of the world, and but as far as direct sales go, I have a few outlets, bookstores, souvenir shops, things like that carry my books as normal, but I don't have nationwide distribution.
No,
that's where I lack an awful lot of, let's call it experience, or I don't know how to do it, and I guess I'm really not that interested in doing it.
Yeah. Have you ever come across audio books? Have you put your books to audio at all?
No, I'm looking into it now. I do have a friend that does voiceovers for commercials and stuff. He's got a beautifully deep voice, radio voice they call it, and I'm thinking. As a matter of fact, he does voiceovers not for a living, but as a part-time gig. He does those.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to him and find out if he knows anything. I don't know how to go about it. I'm not a businessman. I'm just a storyteller.
Yeah.
That's where it began.
As writers, it's different. It's difficult because we need, depending on the strength of your publisher and agent, but we need to be everything, don't we? We need to be our promoter, our writer, our editor, our accountant, our sort of sales
Publicist.
department. Yeah, it's difficult to cover all those bases and be good at all of those, isn't it?
Well, I have thought about hiring a professional publicist, but I'm not sure it would be profitable to do that. You know, they although
That's always a difficult challenge, whether to sort of have an extra outlay to try and ultimately bring in more money. The speculate to accumulate game. As far as audio books, often people say to me, "Is it available? Is your book available on audio?" And it's like,
yes,
well, not at the moment. But so getting somebody to read it for you and having a professional guy like you mentioned is the better way to do it, I think. For me to try and read and do my own audio book is it's difficult to get there, I think, for that.
well, I mentioned hiring a professional publicist. I know an author through I do an awful lot of writing conventions and conferences,
Yeah.
and I know an author there. He's an okay author. I've read a couple of his books, and I've reviewed them for a literary website, and he's okay, but he's not a standout author. But he was able to build a wonderful resume. Everything in it is true. Well, let me put it this way: he was an attorney, a patent attorney, and he got into the army. I think he joined the army, and they wanted him to handle some of their their what do they call that, the material, their I can't remember what they call it, but some of their confidential stuff.
Oh yeah.
And so they put him in the CIA, the Civil Intelligence Authority, and they're the assassins in America. And he did that kind of work in the CIA. He did just paperwork basically. Now he also has a black belt in karate, and so does my grandson and my granddaughter and all those little kids. Anybody can get one. But his resume says, and the division of the CIA that he was in was known as the covert operations. In other words, things that were private. So he builds his resume as a mystery author, ex-CIA covert operations officer.
Yeah, I can imagine that's got a good bit of a pull, bit of a hook to it, hasn't it?
Yes, and it sounds great, but he really wasn't any of that, anything special. And he did hire a very high-end publishing, publicist company. And his third novel debuted at number 37 on the New York Times bestseller list because of the publicist that he hired. It was an okay book. I read it. It was really nothing special, but that's how he made it, by having somebody. It was like the music industry. He had an agent that
Yeah,
promoted
I think
him.
trying to do it all on your own is quite difficult. I did go that route to start with, but I have realised that sort of I need to have a professional editor. I need to have an agent and get a publisher, and that's what I'm working at the moment. My last story, I've sort of not published that. I've sort of trying to get agents, talking to agents about that at the moment. And the new story I'm writing, again, I'm going to go the same route with that and take it through traditional publishing route, because that's the only way you gain traction, I think.
Absolutely. No, I have, from what I've heard at these conferences, I've rubbed elbows with some very big selling authors. some that fly around in private jets and stuff like that, and have television programs now and stuff. And they all tell me. One fellow I met, we had lunch together, and he says I'm now getting $2.3 million advance for every one of my books, and they want one a year. And he said, I was just like you. He said, I've read your book. He said, you're good. You're just as good as I am. He said, but you don't know anybody. He said, I got a book made into a movie. And that was what it took. And everything took off from there. And he's done quite well. He's collecting classic cars and all the things you dream about. And
well, that's the definite moonshot. That's the moonshot, isn't it? Getting I think for everybody that writes a book, they have visions of it being a movie. So to sort of make that happen. As far as your writing process, you mentioned sort of like you've got a nugget of an idea and you expand from that. How long would it take you to write your first draft, Dennis?
Well, it's taken me up to 2 years to write one. But the book I was talking about, Nightmare, the one about the sharks, took me exactly 60 days. And why I'm so proud of that book is that it needed no editing. All it took was correcting typos and grammar and a few things like there wasn't a thought in it that changed. It's just the way it fell out of my head. And it's gotten wonderful reviews. I've had 9 people email me to tell me that they read that book in one sitting. I consider that a huge compliment.
Yeah, that's it. I think it's so easy for people to not finish a book. I think some of the books I read, if it doesn't grab me, I just drop it aside. So I think for someone to sort of take a whole sitting, I've had a couple of mine actually, but the people have said that I could just do with another 200 or 300, saying it. That's the challenge.
Well, I'm working. I've written nothing but mysteries, but now I've decided I have some inspirations, for other books, but they don't involve killing anybody, and so they're a little more difficult. Ellery Queen always said, you know who Ellery Queen was, a great mystery author. He said, when the action begins to slow down, just kill somebody, and that keeps the story going. Now, I have this book. It's a Hemingway type story, and I have it in my mind, and I'm partway through it, but it's very hard for me to write. I've been playing with it off and on almost a year now.
I think you need to start killing some people in it then.
No, I can't kill anybody in this one. This is a very good book. It deals with morals, and my challenge is to keep it interesting, to keep the reader engaged. That is what is difficult to do, and you can do it. I have a friend that writes mysteries, but his writing is so lyrical. It's almost poetry. I'll give you an opening line. This is the thoughts running through the mind of a hard-boiled detective. And this is the opening line of his book. The world is black and white, good and bad, no matter what you hear. Those who say different have already chosen black. And I think that's such a profound line that it just grabs you right away. And but he writes bloodthirsty, murder mysteries. That's a little refined for that kind of a setting.
Yeah, I think just before we wrap up, when you've had your signings, how do you feel about that? Does that give you is that a special boost for you when you are out there in the public and people buying your books directly?
Absolutely. my very first signing was at a major book selling chain, and I, I I sent a letter to every store within 50 miles of my house, and I got one response, and the guy said, "I like to help new local authors," and he was the public relations manager for that store.
Yeah.
He said, "Well, we'll do a signing with you." And I went in, and I expected they bought the books from the publisher, and they had a desk set up in the middle of the store with a bunch of books piled on it. But out in front of the desk, there were a bunch of folding chairs set up auditorium style. And I asked the guy, I said, "What's this all about?" And he said, "We have a book club that meets here." And I said, "Oh, that's nice." And so I was expecting people to come up and get a book signed. Well, people started coming in, and they sat in all those chairs. And he said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you." He said, "We featured your book in the book club, and these people have all read it." And there was about 40 or 50 people there, and it scared the daylights out of me. And he introduced me. He said, "Mr. Collins is going to tell you about his journey." I had no idea. And I did an hour. I did a solid hour, and it was videotaped. And when I saw the videotape, I was so pleased that I didn't say and about a dozen times, and everything seemed to flow pretty well. And people came up and started asking me questions. And one of the guys said, "Well, there's that place you've got in the upper part of the state." He said, "I never knew that was there." And I said, "Well, it isn't there. I made it up." And he said, "It's a little embarrassing for me," because he said, I work for the state, and I am the state historian. I should know that." And I said, "Oh, wow." And then a lady came up, and she said, I want you to know we put your book in our school library." And I said, "That's nice." And she said, "I'm the Dean of Literature for the Michigan State University." And I told her, I said, "I'm so glad I didn't know who you guys were before I started talking. I would have been stuttering and backing up and falling over." But I got through it. And I do presentations all the time, and I never prepare one word. It's
No,
the only time I
good
did.
it's good sometimes just let it roll off, isn't it? Like with all of my interviews, I have a few questions and that sort of thing, but it's nice to just run with it, isn't it?
Well, I like the kind where it's a book club and they have already read the book, because they ask very, very intelligent questions.
Yeah.
If they haven't read the book, they can't know those things. But the only time I was prepared with a prepared speech was when I was asked to give a keynote address for it was a Michigan Council of the Arts and their annual dinner at a country club, and I was asked to give a keynote address, which is different from a presentation.
Yeah.
Because that's really a sales pitch, and that's the only time I've ever been prepared. And I get through them all the time. I've been on television a couple times with those. On my website. I did a radio interview in Chicago for I don't know what station it was, but I never prepared for those things, and I seem to get by. Spontaneity works better, I think, than
and that is the stream of consciousness, isn't it?
well. That's how I write. I began as a little kid. We lived on the beach, and we had bonfires on the beach every night. We had a lot of driftwood, so every night we'd have a bonfire and cook hot dogs or something, and I would tell stories around the camp. The campfire is a great place to tell stories,
Yeah.
and it would be about some monster in the woods or something like that. But I was a storyteller, and I enjoyed that role. I loved getting up in front of the crowd and telling them, talking and being the center of attention for a moment, and so that's basically how I got started storytelling. and I love to tell stories. I don't think of myself as a writer. I think of myself as a storyteller.
Yeah, that's it.
And
And Dennis, you have actually been a massive treat for me. It's so good to hear people sort of talk about sort of the way their nuggets of it sort of expand and that sort of thing, and then going out to fairs and events to sell your books
oh
direct.
yeah,
It's just
library. I like libraries. I canvass libraries regularly. As they, if you would like somebody to address one of your book clubs, a Rotary Club, a Lions Club, I don't care what it is, I'd be more than happy to, because people don't know authors. They envision authors as professor like, you know, they with the tweed coat and the leather patches on the arms and the the, the pipe and the cap, and
that's it. Yeah,
authors aren't like that. Well, you know that they're
yeah,
ordinary people,
yeah.
and but the general public has a vision of an author. I don't fit it, and I
No,
don't think
well,
most
mate,
authors.
I don't think. Yeah, Dennis, this has been fantastic. Thanks everybody for watching. The Budding Author podcast. We have lots more interviews to come, and lots more great advice and stepping into the journey of authors just like Dennis. And
Yeah,
that's been a great
my
pleasure.
my advice to a new author is just keep writing. You can always fix something, but you can't fix nothing.
Exactly. I like that. That's going to be in the. I'm going to quote that for this interview. Brilliant.
Okay,
Thanks, Dennis.
for having me.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you for having me.